Welcome to the Dragon's Den. I'm your venerable host Orochi, and today we're going to finish our discussion on the Pathfinder playtest Kineticist. I've had 2 sessions of playtime with this now, and neither of them were fantastic, but I can kind of see where the class could shine. My first combat was in a narrow corridor, so that didn't go well at all because I want to use my damage aura, but it affects friendlies, so that whole battle I was just trying to not hurt my friendlies while trying to get into melee combat, while the rest of my range group, since they had guns, they just destroyed the enemy before I could get there, so that wasn't fun. Second combat was sort of more of the same, tiny little room, so I couldn't use my aura, and I tried tanking a little bit with stone, but then the problem with the stone shield block is that once you use it, you lose all the benefits of having the stone shield. You lose the +2 to AC and Fortitude. So it's a guessing game. It's like, oh, something just hits you for a modest amount of damage. The first enemy that goes, first turn. Do you want to shield block that and then become vulnerable because your class is low AC? Because I built for a strength build. So I have low ACs. Like, do you want to lower your AC and risk fortitude saves being worse to block the first attack? And I was like, no, it was only 6 damage. I could have completely negated that, but I'm like, there's another enemy, or really 2, and maybe some more in another room because one of them just ran away. So we might pull some additional stuff, so I'm going to wait. And I didn't get attacked for the rest of the round, so there's that big problem of you just kind of got to guesstimate and hope for the best with your shield block, which I'm sure some people will like that sort of risk-reward play, but for me, I think it's gonna start stepping into the analysis paralysis kind of area where it's like, I don't ever want to do this because then I might need it later in the round. And that's simultaneously more of a me problem, but also just a general, when you're trying to use something to the best of its ability, that can be an issue. The third fight was a boss fight that just did not go well. We almost TPK'd, so I wasn't the only one having a problem there. And I got a good use out of tidal hands just because an enemy rolled a 1, but I think that if they had rolled almost anything else, they would have saved, and so my damage wouldn't have been as impressive as it was, which is a big problem with casters, and even bigger problem with Kineticist, is that spell AoE damage is not huge. It does not scale up well compared to how fast monster HP scales up. Not even highest level spell slots scale that well. Like, a lot of people are like, oh, they're great for mooks. Is like, you know what's also great for mooks? Just piling on them with your marshals. Because I've played in a game where, after level 10, I played through Ruby Phoenix, and the martial characters in my group were hitting for like 60 to 100 and something damage per round. Like 60 damage per hit, fairly often getting 2 hits around, so doing well into the hundreds of damage per turn. So you can completely and utterly eliminate one enemy every round if your team focus fires. And that's more important than doing like a third of all the enemy's health every round, because that's not actually taking anything out of combat. There's still threats there. And also the logistics of, hey, if you don't go first, you don't get to have everything lined up perfectly for whatever line or cone or burst you need to be able to hit things. So there's a lot of negatives to spell blasting, not just it's not high enough damage because it's mediocre damage. It's all right, but you really need to hit like 3 or 4 enemies with something to even, like, 3 enemies I say is breaking par with a martial. So you need to hit 4 or more enemies to start getting over that and actually being useful with your friggin' spell slots. And when you look at all the kineticist damage, it's like the one of the better spells. I think Tidal Hands scales at half the rate that Fireball does. So that's at higher levels. That's just not going to be sufficient enough damage for anything. Even if you could use it round after round, it's just not good enough. Like, maybe if you could use it the first 2 rounds of combat, if you could hit multiple enemies with it 2 rounds in a row, it might help you mop things up faster. But the logistics of getting cones to hit 3 or 4 enemies 2 turns in a row is like almost non-existent. Because once you show that, hey, I can do this cone, enemies are going to disperse and they're going to rush your lines and flank you, and it's just not going to work the vast majority of the time. So the class needs to be able to be front-loaded in damage, because this class isn't even very good at winning initiative. So it needs, when the moment shines of, oh, everything's lined up so I can hit with my ability, it needs to do significant damage. You can't, and I know that this is sort of a problem with Pathfinder 2 in general, is that they balance things on what is the top in the perfect white room situation. What is this capable of? We need to make sure that that is how it's balanced, as if you could do that all the time. And so niche abilities and abilities that are not capable of doing that every time, just because of the way the game's played, hurt significantly in this system, which has always been and will probably always be a problem. So it's gonna hurt this class when it eventually comes out. My second test, the fights were mostly the same. I got more use out of my aura, which was the icy Winter's Clutch, which is a cool aura. And I'm sure you can mathemize out that it's good damage because it's automatic damage. And if you're hitting enough targets, it's really impressive. But when you're playing in a group that uses guns and is good at debuffing and flanking and flat-footing and all this stuff, so that they're regularly getting 1 or 2 crits every fight, like when your fighter goes boom and hits for 40 damage and you're hitting for 3 with your aura and then maybe striking for like 12, like that's, it feels real bad. But that's sort of a scaling issue, and also it feels a lot better when your marshals are spending 2 of their actions in a turn to reload, because that sucks for them. So it's a bit of a give and take, but the numbers might be slightly out of whack. None of the fights in my second game really shined all that much. They were mediocre. I did modest damage. I did a bunch of blasts. I did a little bit of healing when I couldn't use my AoE, so that was kind of cool. But it feels like a lot of the kineticist abilities are sort of use this early in the fight, and they're all about like pre-buffing or pre-debuffing or having your stuff up. Like, they ramp up, but fights only last like 3 or 4 rounds in this game, so having characters who can't pre-buff themselves and who like to ramp up their power over a few turns, it feels bad because they don't ever get to like a catastrophically powerful state. Like, if you put a kineticist into a battle that lasted 8 rounds, you wouldn't get stronger than every other character, even though it takes you several rounds to get your abilities rolling. And so in shorter battles, it really feels like you're not contributing. So that's basically my experience in play. My overall thoughts on the class in total is I think it's really close to something awesome, especially since we're going to be getting more feats with the final version and 2 more elements. I can't wait to see what those do. But I think like the way that it scales is maybe a little, it tries to be a caster a lot, with a lot of its feats that you get past level 10 are very interesting, so that they can't be picked up by other classes. Because when you think about it, unless they make the multi-class dedication for this really wonky, like if somebody can just take your blasts, then a fighter's going to be better with your blast than you ever will be, by a long shot. And any class can take your feats, and since the feats scale with your character level, anybody can take all of your like bread and butter feats that you get at level 1 and up through level 10, and they will auto scale to be as strong as your stuff. So like all of the best stuff in the class can kind of be taken by better core classes. The only thing that this class has built into it that can't be stolen without them creating a feat to give it away is the adaptability and the flexibility. So I think adding more stuff to both of those, and also the level 3 ability to steal stuff, to steal element from stuff. So if they broaden that ability to steal element to anything that has any abilities that have the elemental tag, not just creatures having that elemental tag, that will go a long way to making that ability a lot better. And the adaptability skill could be a lot better because it scales up twice at level 7 and level 12. And if they just put more cool stuff into that, then that would be great. But it also needs to just have, there needs to be a class damage mechanic somewhere, because the class doesn't have one. It has no core mechanic other than blasts. But if you don't give blasts to multi-classes, then it's going to feel kind of stupid that ranged elemental blasts are what the class is about, but that's not what you get from the multi-class. So you got to figure that blasts are going to be given away to the multi-class. Your bread and butter feats are going to be given away to the multi-class. There needs to be some other core mechanic of this class that stays with it, and hopefully it's some sort of damage mechanic that will scale up with level. I don't think it needs to scale much. It needs to kind of be like the Inventors, where, you know, just maybe +1 damage per die to both blasts and impulses. Like all your impulses get a +1 to damage per die, and that can scale up to like at level 7 +2, at level 12 +3, and then get an additional much higher level adaptability perk at like level 16 or 17 or something that'll make it like +4 damage per die. That'll make it so that your blasts are doing an extra 4 damage, and all your impulses are doing a significant amount of damage. Because if you're rolling d4s, if you roll like 10 d4s, then that's going to be like 40 extra damage onto that. And I think that'll put most of your blasts into most of your overflows and stuff into really good place. Because there's already I think a single gate feat that gives you damage scaling similar to that. I know that it gives you damage and then it doubles that damage on overflows. And I think that sort of just needs to become the class mechanic overall. Just improved to also do your blasts as well as your standard impulses and overflows. Because then you can actually be trying to, you know, blast things for decent damage. I think it needs to try and do competitive damage when just hitting 2 creatures in an AoE. I mean, yes, the class will be able to put out better damage numbers if you can use 2 actions for overflow impulse, and then also in the same turn do a regular ranged blast. It's like, sure, that's going to be better than what casters do, but casters are already getting 2 to 3 times the damage scaling you are. So I think having more flat damage on it while keeping the die small, D4s and D6s, it'll allow you to do a higher low minimum amount of damage, and that will keep this class more on the scale the fighter is, where the fighter is good at, doing average damage with some spikes. This class will get rid of the spikes but keep a fair high average damage, which I think would be a good place for it. But a lot of these abilities are super cool. Action economy is terrible for a lot of different things, and I hope that they think about dropping the level 16 or 17 class ability that gives you free draw an element down to much lower level, and then put some other thing at higher level. I don't know, it just feels like the action economy is really rough with 2 and 3 action overflows, because then you've got to redraw your element, so they're all actually 3 and 4 actions, and you can't do any of your defensive things, you can't prepare for, changing your element to something else. It's so restrictive. And I hope that improves, even if there's a cost to it where you have to, I don't want to say you have to take a feat. Like, a lot of people have suggested, having feat branches where you take this feat branch to make your impulses better, and you take this feat branch to make your blasts feel better. And I think that's the worst possible thing you could do, because they're just going to be feat taxes. Like somebody else mentioned, that sounds like why the alchemist is terrible, is because they have to pay feat taxes just to stop sucking so bad. So I don't think we want that. We have a lot of really cool feats. Some of them are mediocre and can be buffed up some, but just the way that the game works in general, with action economy and with how, like in APs, all fights are in close quarters, and enemies are going to be up to your party's face, if not flanking around you within the first turn, so you're not going to be getting any AoEs off and stuff. All that needs to be considered in the class's power budget, instead of thinking, oh, how could this class operate if they were in a giant open field and were able to just, put the wind aura on at 30 feet so that whole area is difficult terrain for all enemies, and then just blast away. Like, that's possible, but how often is that going to really happen? Like, in APs, almost never. So, I don't know, I think that sort of stuff needs to be considered. Like, this class is almost never going to be played to its potential. Its potential is really high, but you need to have the right kineticist into the right party. Like, your party needs to be built to make the best use of your kineticist abilities, especially if you're single or dual gate. So this is very much not a class that you can just go, oh, hey, I want to play a kineticist in a random group. It's like, no, you don't, because you're going to be bad. Most of what you bring to the table is not going to be used to its full potential, so it's going to be very weak. And I think that's going to be a problem of, like, how do you balance a class that can be stupid powerful in a good group? Because if you have an air kineticist who has their difficult terrain aura on, and you have a whole team that does knockback, and you've got a monk that does whirling throw and all this stuff, so that even on your regular stuff, on your regular pushes, it makes it so that enemies can't step back to where they were. They have to use a move action. So then you capitalize on that by having a bunch of characters who have attacks of opportunity, and that kineticist is going to be a force multiplier in that group. Whereas you put that same kineticist in a different group that's all, skirmish tactics and stuff, is like, they might work decently if everyone's moving around, but if they're in a group that is just spank and tank, it's like, well, they're not really bringing anything to that group because you're not using their abilities to what they're good at. So that's a big problem in this class, is that its potential for greatness is pretty high, but in reality, like, yes, building your perfect party and making sure that all the characters have abilities that synchronize with each other is a part of Pathfinder, and it can significantly improve your play experience. Like, my Fist of the Ruby Phoenix group was very much built to support each other and capitalize on each other's abilities, and so we destroyed everything in that AP. Like, I mean, there was no battles where anybody went down. Most battles we barely got hurt. We absolutely destroyed everything in the entire AP. Like, there were boss battles that we almost finished in one round. It was heinous what a good group that synergizes well in Pathfinder 2 can do. But what you have to give up in that is you're not going to be able to play the character you want. You have to have everybody be like, okay, well, I want to play this character. It's like, okay, well, what classes and what things can those classes build for would synergize with that? And that really limits your options, because I do not think enough thought went into all these classes when Pathfinder 2 was in the original playtest to try and make it so that every class brings synergistic abilities to the table, which I think is unfortunate, because you look at the classes that do have synergistic abilities, and they're just the classes everyone rates high just because they're good classes. And I'm not sure if people realize that's sort of the reason why those classes are so great. Like, Fighter, Champion, Rogue, Bard, those are all like A and S tier classes because they bring the most amount of stuff to the table, and the things that they do bring, other classes are able to capitalize on as well, and that's why they're the best classes in the game. I'll probably do a little bit more of a deep dive on that in another video, because I don't think people talk enough about class synergy between, like, the best classes. People have argued on the forums, like, oh, I want to make a tier list of classes. Like, oh, what does that even mean? And it's, like, the best classes bring the most amount of stuff to the table, especially stuff that other classes can make use of. And I feel like Kineticist falls deep into that territory where the core of the class does not bring anything special to the game, but a lot of their feats bring so much very specific stuff to the table that other classes can capitalize on, that they're in a little bit of a rough spot where you can build a group around a kineticist, and that group could rock the shit out of stuff. But if you're just a random kineticist going into a random group, they could be extremely weak and feel terrible to play. The way that the gate mechanic works is rather cool. I hope we get more feats specific to tying into that. But I also think that because of the way that the single gate is tied to, well, single and double are all tied to, you just get a bunch of free first level feats, that feels a bit rough, because then you're like, oh, well, now I have to make specific decisions on 4th and 6th level feats. Do I want to take my elemental stuff or my class stuff? So I think when you get to flexibility, the class feature that gives you a free feat, I think it would be nice if single and dual gates got at least one extra feat over universalists. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was a fourth gate type that specifically used the new ones that they're going to bring in. So that'll be interesting to see how all of that works out. Because if the universalist just gets these two extra gates that do have the potential to do all this other new stuff, that's going to feel even worse for dual and single gates. So I hope they get more feats while leveling up so you can take more of your cooler, higher level stuff. So overall, I think the class is close to greatness. The problem is the holes that it has are pretty deep. And even some of the smaller ones, like mechanically and mathematically, probably aren't terrible, but they feel bad. Like going from level 5 and 6 and not getting expert in your strikes feels bad, but I understand why it's there. It's so that you don't eclipse marshals for a short amount of time, and or aren't on par with marshals for a short amount of time because you have easier access to a better damage if you take Earth. And that's a whole nother issue of, like, Earth is the only really great damage blast, whereas the others get more range, and Agile does help. Like, having Agile on your ranged attacks, like, there's almost nothing else in the game that does that, so that's a big thing, even if you lose damage from. And it would feel a lot better if the class had a standard damage mechanic to it, because then those having such tiny die wouldn't hurt you nearly so much. So damage needs to go up a bit. The way the DC scales and the way that the strike proficiency scales is, it's not terrible. It's just that those are multipliers, and when your standard damage for blasts and impulses is already looking pretty bad, knowing that there's a multiplier on it that lowers its damage even more because of the way DCs and strikes work mathematically over time, that feels even more terrible when you're like, oh, my ability goes up by 1d6 every 2 levels, while the standard fireball goes up by 2d6 every 2 levels. It's like, huh. And then I also have a lower DC than a spellcaster, so stuff is going to resist my stuff more often, if not outright critical resist it more. So that just, it's a compounding feels bad on feels bad sort of situation. I'm not sure if they want to fix that, though. And I think keeping it that way, while it would suck for, critical successes ignoring your damage, I think putting in a static damage mechanic to the class would help all of that in every other situation other than when you're missing a lot because you have low proficiency and when things are critical saving. But maybe that's a balancing factor of the class. It would just be nice to see a class mechanic built into it that really does cool stuff and really makes you hit more consistently with your abilities. But that's my general thoughts on it. It's really good, really close to being awesome, but some of the cracks in it they just really, really hamper the feel of the class and how fun it is to play. Especially when you get lots of abilities, when you're dual or universalist, and you have all of these potential cool things you could do, but then you're like, well, I don't have the feats for it because I'm universal, or I just don't have the action economy to swap between my 2 elements as a dual gate. Those are really bad, big issues that I hope can be addressed at some point. But yep, it's fun, and hopefully the final version will not only be cool and flavorful and have awesome abilities, like a bunch of the abilities it currently has, but also just the general feel in play will feel super awesome for the final version because it's close. Like, as much as people are complaining about very specific things, I think the fact that there's only a small handful of things people are complaining about, and one of them is damage, that shows that people like the things it can do, they just don't have the impact people would want. And hopefully that's an easy fix, and it'll be great when it finishes. That's all for now. See you in the next one.